first started speaking to David Watson about it because we had regular conversations, and then I started speaking to different people and saying, hey, you know, this isn't working in cities. It's not working in cities. And initially, you know, a lot of guys were very excited about what was happening around the world, and the excitement was almost causing a denial. You know, well, we don't actually have a problem. But slowly, as we started to look at what was taking place, we realized that globally, movements were breaking down in cities. And so that led to a gathering last year in Texas, and we got some guys together and we started to think through, just one day, what is it about cities that causes movement to break down? The way we currently or traditionally see, Peter, I'm using the word tradition in terms of movements, so not just church. So the way that they break down, what causes them to break down in urban environments? I think this is a very, very key issue for us in South Africa, and hopefully we'll get to that in a moment. But if you move around the world, you realize that South Africa is very urban in our mindset. Even what we would call villages are actually an urban mindset. And so the kind of places where movement was really catching fire are true villages. But our villages are not true villages anymore. And you see that in subtle shifts from the authority of the village is no longer the chief, but he's a ward councillor. There's a subtle shift there from what a traditional village is to an institutional village, which moves towards an urban kind of thinking. And so this is a very critical issue for us, because if we don't think this through, then everything that we do in terms of attempting to see movement happen is going to break down in this country. Not only in this country, but much of Southern Africa has a similar kind of setting. We have a lot of rural areas, but we also have a lot of urban areas. And so I want to talk about urban movements, and I want to guide us through some of the discussions. And I'm going to really try and do this in two parts because we're running out of time. First of all, we're going to just look at identifying the problems. And identifying the problems is the first step to finding solutions. So let's look at what are the challenges that we face in urban areas. The reason that this is such an important issue, and I mentioned that earlier, is that the tipping point was reached in 2007, mid-2007. Around that time, for the first time in the history of the world, more people lived in cities than in rural areas. And if you project that forward to 2050, you'll see that around that time, 70% of the world will be in cities. Now, there are actually some people in this room that you kind of hope to still be alive in 2050. And some of you, your children will be alive in 2050. It's not that far away. And yet, when we get to the year 2050, if the current movement, migration of people from rural areas to cities, to urban environments continues, then in 2050, 70% of the world will live in cities. Now, here's the challenge. All our current church planting and church methodology, including movements, is designed for rural areas. Our current churches come from a village model of church. Right across South Africa, you go and find Church Street, and what's at the end of Church Street? The church. Why? Because it was a little village, and the church was the center of that little town, and everything happened in that little town. It wasn't just church that happened there. You got married there, you got buried there, you got, the dances where the social life was there, everything was there, the cake sales, everything was there. But South Africa's shifted, radically shifted, and we've become urbanized. And that urban shift means that model of church, no matter how big you grow it, and no matter how flashy you make it, or how much technology you put in there, or how many speakers you invite from other countries to try and wow the crowds, essentially that model of church that was birthed back in a rural setting is dying. And Roy and some of the guys from the States will tell you that if you look at what's happening in the United States, it's absolute crisis. Absolute crisis. And they got all these fancy terms for, generations. They're baby boomers and they're something busters and they, you know. But here's the bottom line. His grandfather's generation, 80% of them went to church. His generation, 60% go to church. The next generation, 20% go to church. The next generation that right now is coming into maturity, 4% are going to church. That means in one generation, it's de-churched. And we need to think about how to reach that generation. And yet, here's the challenge, it's urbanized. And it's increasingly urban. The rate of urbanization in Africa is one of the fastest in the world. The rate at which people are moving to cities and adopting an urban mindset. And so it's a really critical issue for us. If you look at the world's largest city, Tokyo, 35 million people. 35 million people living in a high-density environment. Now, I don't even have to ask you very long. You'll know the answer straight away. Do people behave differently in that environment to the way they behave on a farm or in a village? They behave completely differently, don't they? In fact, everything changes. Their social structure changes, their behavior changes, the way they relate changes. And movements ride on the back of social structure. They ride on the back of society structure. The whole issue of replication assumes that every person knows a whole lot of other people and have networks, and that the gospel can run along those networks. Well, what happens when those networks break down? You've got a problem. If you look at the 5 largest cities in the world are in Asia: Tokyo, Japan, in China, Jakarta, Indonesia, Seoul, Korea, and China. These are huge cities. So when we talk about cities, people often think we're talking about these massive cities, urban environments. But the fact is, I live in Gauteng. The latest stat says 12.5 million people. That's huge. And it's not just a province. It's a metropolis. It's a metroplex. The metroplex is where 2 large cities have become so large they've joined. There are very few in the world, and Gauteng is one of them. Pretoria and Johannesburg have literally joined into one metroplex, one massive city that just about fills the province of Gauteng. And I live right in the middle of that, so it's really critical to me to work out this issue. Exactly where they join, that's where I live. So I've got to think through this, and when people think about urban, they think about these big cities. But the reality is that the urban mindset kicks in, not just in these big cities. It kicks in wherever we move to high-density environments. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Cities are powerfully economic. Economics drives them. It absolutely drives them. But at the same time, there's a lot of poverty in cities. You go to Brazil and you see this huge divide between rich and poor. It's unbelievable in these urban environments. Yeah, before I started traveling around, I thought South Africa was quite unique in that, but we're not that unique. We're not that unique. And so you stand in Brazil and you can literally stand in some of the wealthiest houses and overlook some of the worst slums right next to you. So cities have this amazing complexity about them that makes it really difficult for us to think through movements.